Well, good afternoon. We're going to begin, and welcome to today's session titled Building Your Ambulance to Meet the New Crash Safety Requirements. Today's session is sponsored by Furno, and our goal is to provide you some information about national crash safety requirements and how they may be ultimately incorporated at the state and local regulatory level. Your panelists this afternoon are Dia Gaynor, the Executive Director of the National Association of EMS Officials, Jim Green, Safety Engineer with National Institute for Occupational Health, known as NIOSH, Steve Spada, the Association for the Work Truck Industry, and Troy Hagan, who's the CEO of Care Ambulance and the President of the National EMS Management Association. We're going to have several brief presentations followed by a time for you to ask some questions. So with that, without further ado, Dia.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. In the interest of setting the bar low so that the rest of the presenters look better than me, I'm going to talk about why safety matters, and hopefully this is something central to the focus in all of your minds. But I'm going to share some very, very interesting graphical analysis with you that you may not have seen, produced by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which is home to our Office of Emergency Medical Services. They use something called the Fatality Analysis Reporting System, as well as the National Automotive Sampling System General Estimate System. Now, that is a phrase created by bureaucrats, huh? Or NASGES. And these are used for a variety of statistical purposes, not only quantifying motor vehicle crashes and death rates around the United States, but also special focus areas such as commercial vehicles and others. And for the first time, they performed an analysis of 20 years of data specific to ambulances. So this is strictly ambulances, not other vehicles that may be associated with an EMS agency. And their findings in that 20-year period were that there were an annual average of 4,500 motor vehicle traffic crashes involving an ambulance. 4,500 every year over 20 years. That's a lot of crashes. How many people think the number is actually higher? There are many that do. Nonetheless, while the vast majority resulted only in property damage, the fact was that over one third, resulted in one or more injured subjects. And those data do not include ambulance-caused collisions. The ambulance must have been involved in the collision to be counted in this. So when you look at it from 4 segments of 5-year spans, beginning with the date range of 1992 to 1996, the blue bars are those property damage only ambulance-involved crashes. The green bars are those that resulted in injury and those that are fatals. There are some who are holding up this slide trying to say, oh, look how small the fatality rate is. But the fact is that the average annual number of deaths of ambulance-involved crashes was 33. So that's one person killed in or by an ambulance every 10 to 11 days. Who's okay with that? Especially if we think secretly the number might really be higher. And over time, obviously, there have been some dips and some spikes, but nothing out of really normal variation. As far as those injuries are concerned, an average annual number of 1,500 crashes resulting in 2,600 people being injured every year. 2,600 people. And again, this is broken down into 4 or 5-year segments. The number of persons is the green bar. The number of crashes is the gray one. And this is all online at EMS.gov. So don't worry about scrambling to grab it off the screen here. One of the opportunities for analysis is a result of something I'll talk really quickly about in a minute or two, and that's what the ambulance crash, or rather the vehicle crash report that the law enforcement officer fills out can be elicited is where was the person? And in almost 2/3 of the cases, the individual who was killed in a crash involving an ambulance was an occupant of another vehicle. So we're actually seeing only 1/3 that are occupants of the ambulance, either as the driver, the passenger, or in 12% of the cases, pedestrian or not inside another vehicle, but, perhaps a bicyclist or a pedestrian. Similarly, injured persons in crashes in that 20-year period, 54% were injured, were in other vehicles, not in the ambulance, and a little less than half were inside the ambulance. So the other breakdown that's possible because of the record the law enforcement officer fills out is what was the operational status of the ambulance. So of the annual average 29 deaths, or fatal crashes rather, resulting in an average of 33 deaths every year, 58% were while the ambulance was in emergency use. And similarly, 59% of those crashes involving an injury were while in emergency use. But what the statisticians who live in the motor vehicle crash world like to point out is that this doesn't address the proportion of time that vehicles are in use in emergency mode versus non-emergency mode, nor is it possible to estimate these by vehicle miles traveled. And again, the frequency shown by year. There are limitations to the analysis. That's one of the slides that you can pull off of EMS.gov as far as the limitations of these data. And there's also a really good summary slide that if you want to steal that, this is public domain, you can use it as it might work in any safety classes or orientations for elected officials that you might need to do. I brought up the Model Minimum Uniform Crash Criteria, or MUC. That's the sort of the national NEMSIS equivalent or data dictionary for law enforcement officers' use. I want to bring very quickly and then conclude to your attention the fact that MUC's 4th edition has just been released. And while it was a big fight, believe it or not, we got an ambulance diagram added to the appendix that has diagrams of every other conceivable vehicle, but it never had an ambulance seating diagram. So it is up to your state Office of Highway Safety or your state police, whichever organization is in charge of deciding the design of the crash report used by law enforcement officers, to adopt the 4th edition. And if they adopt the 4th edition, it is their option to adopt the ambulance seating diagram, and I encourage you to look into where and how that's happening. There are other documents available related to this critical safety issue and a lot of resources listed at that site as well. So I'll conclude there and turn the microphone over to Jim Green.
Thank you, Dia. As was mentioned, I work for the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. Our focus is primarily worker safety. When we started looking at this issue, we saw primarily workers in the back of the ambulance unrestrained. And so our early goals were to try and rectify that situation. We've done a lot of work since those days, and we formed partnerships with the ambulance manufacturers, with NHTSA, with the Department of Homeland Security, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, quite a number of individuals. Associate members of the ambulance manufacturers in the cot manufacturing world and the seating world also have participated in our work. When we went after this work, as we started to get a bit of a toehold in the industry, we came up with a couple of overarching goals, and these goals really embodied what drove each of our different research segments. We wanted, one, to recognize that this was a work environment, but we were trying to achieve the same level of safety in this work environment, this mobile work environment, as you'd have in your own car. We also wanted to work with end users to make sure designs actually meet your needs. It doesn't do us any good to come up with a great seat and stick it in a place where you can't use it and say we've done our job. We haven't. Our near-term goal, which we have just about completed, is to develop a family of standards that deal with different components within the patient compartment. So we've looked at crash testing, we've looked at seats, restraint designs, cots, equipment mounts, cabinets, those kinds of things, and I'll talk a little bit about each of those. Long term, and this is where everybody in this room has the ability to have an impact, it's taking those family of standards, those individual component standards, and moving them into a bumper-to-bumper document. And you'll hear a little more about that today. Most of you are familiar with the GSA purchase specification as kind of the de facto standard. I'm sure many of you are familiar with NFPA 1917, and more recently another document has been started that's out for review, the GVS 2015. When I talk about a bumper-to-bumper standard, it's those three documents I'm referring to. The work that we've done is to do component-specific standards that would be referenced in those bumper-to-bumper standards. And the most important thing with everything we've done is we wanted to validate the standards. So we didn't want to just take best practices and try and apply those to the ambulance industry. We wanted to actually run through the tests, validate that we could create a new seat or a new cot or an improved patient compartment that actually meets those standards. So when you go out on the floor and talk to some of your manufacturers, they've been working towards these goals with us. So what were we really talking about? This is a picture I've used. Many of you may have even seen two ambulances in the same service. The one on the right was involved in a rollover, did not have an occupant or patient in the back. The one on the left is a sister ambulance in the same service. And when I look at these two pictures, it tells me we have a lot of opportunities for improvement when I look at that ambulance on the right. Happily, no one was injured in the back of this ambulance, but look at those opportunities for injury, whether it's equipment or the cot. We have great opportunities to perhaps do a better job. We also had to bound our research. So when we started looking at crash test standards, we went back to the automotive community, and we utilized the same criteria that's utilized for our automotive crash testing. So they right now crash our cars at 30 miles an hour into a barrier as the baseline. And that's 30 to 0 in about 1/8 of a second. It's a lot more energy than it sounds like. They don't design, the picture on the right is roughly 60 miles an hour, and you see the state of that automobile. That's likely not a survivable event. So we bounded our project work with the same limits that you see in the automotive world. When we went out to do this, nobody had really done much ambulance crash test work. There had been some done here and in Canada, but we didn't have data to characterize the vehicle. So we embarked on a program that included 3 frontal crash tests, 4 side impact tests, 2 rear impact tests, and we've done 3 roll tests. All of that was built around the concept of understanding what happens in the ambulance when it crashes. When an ambulance or a vehicle hits a wall, it crushes, it absorbs energy. Some of that energy, though, isn't absorbed and crushed, it's transferred to the back of the vehicle, to your seat, whether it's a car or an ambulance. So we had to understand that. And I have a couple of quick videos just to show you. The one on the left is a 30-mile-an-hour ambulance into a barrier. Oops. And we'll go back and try again. And what I'm trying to show is that it is substantial. There is a lot of energy that's eaten in the front part of the ambulance, but we've also transferred a lot of energy on these very stiff rails to the back of the ambulance. The photo here on the right is another video. This is an unrestrained occupant, a standard antlered cot, and a restrained with lap belt. The front of the vehicle is over here. It ran earlier. There we go. You see the unrestrained went into the front wall. These are crash test dummies that are instrumented, the same type of dummies used in automotive testing. So we again followed those principles. The cot in this case came off of the floor, it came out of the antler. We had it tethered because we were aware that this was likely to happen. Again, an opportunity for improvement. Now looking from the top down at this patient, you'll see we have our shoulder harnesses on, 30-mile-an-hour crash into the front of the ambulance. A tremendous amount of excursion on that occupant. So when we look at our standards, we have opportunities. This helps bound what we're going to do in the future. So what did we do? And I'm just going to use the cot as an example. And I'll tell you about the others, but we don't have enough time to go into all of the detail. If we use the cot as an example, we have the same goal for the seat. And the goals are keep the cot attached to the floor at these prescribed crash loads that we've developed, keep the patient on the cot, and reduce the excursion of that patient to 14 inches or less. They're fully instrumented dummies, again, the same dummies that we use in your automotive testing. 30-mile-an-hour crash, we recreated it. Furno and Stryker both participated in this program. They both have developed products that now meet this requirement. They stay attached to the floor. They reduce the excursion of the occupant under that 14 inches. This illustration is the end point, or the greatest excursion on this particular test. And the 14-inch line is here. This particular one was just under 11 inches off the end of the cot. By comparison, the one that I showed you in the crash test, we were measuring greater than 30 inches of excursion. So whether you had a seat at the head of the cot or not, you should expect, even with those shoulder harnesses, a tremendous amount of excursion and opportunity, whether that occupant hits a worker or hits an empty seat or perhaps hits a front bulkhead. We followed that same methodology with seating. So in our seats, if you have a seat that's forward-facing or rear-facing, your seat manufacturers have agreed to test those. We had 3 seat manufacturers and 3 restraint manufacturers that participated. This is just a photo. You see a front and rear-facing seat, crash test dummy included. We're using all of the same parameters that we use in an automotive test for allowable neck load, head acceleration, etc. in these tests. So we now have products that meet a new standard that's crash load based, specifically designed for an ambulance that can be purchased now. We're doing the same thing for equipment mounts. We've tested probably on the order of 60 different pieces of equipment and mounts. Again, we offer in the standard written for this one a dynamic test option. So again, you crash test these on a sled with the same energy, or you can do a static test on the equipment mounts with what we call an amplification factor, or a little higher load if you choose the static test option. Again, there are products that can meet these load levels now. It's a matter of selection. We have some additional work still ongoing. We're very close to completing. In that early picture of the before and after ambulance, you saw a lot of equipment that was that came out of the cabinet. So we have a cabinet standard that we're looking at as well. Again, a dynamic test of the cabinet. We want to make sure that whatever you stow in that cabinet stays in that cabinet. So there will be some changes in some of the cabinet design and cabinet hardware to be able to meet that goal of keeping our equipment safely in the cabinet so it doesn't become something that can injure the occupant. We're working on looking at opportunities to make the interior surfaces less likely to injure you. Some of your manufacturers have already made some changes in cabinet design and location, bulkhead padding, those kinds of things. And so we're doing additional work with different materials and different construction methods to look at reducing the likelihood that a wall surface or a cabinet would cause an injury if you impacted it. And finally, one that I want to discuss, it's still ongoing, and actually if anybody here is from the Dayton, Ohio or Hartford, Connecticut area, you'd have an opportunity to participate. We're doing a human sizing study. So we actually have a mobile lab that's going to EMS organizations around the country with the goal of measuring more than 600 workers. The hypothesis is that EMS workers are larger than the general population. And if that's the case, then our gear that we utilize, our seating, all should accommodate that larger person. We've done these studies on firefighters, and certainly we found that the average firefighter is larger than the average person in the United States. We've done it with truck drivers as well and construction workers. So this is another opportunity. I put the plug in for Dayton and Hartford because I know those are the next 2 target locations for this work. So my summary slide is there's a lot going on. At the beginning, I talked about bumper-to-bumper standards. GSA is not a standard, it's a purchase specification, but it's what many states are using now as their de facto standard. NFPA 1917 and GVS 2015 are also bumper-to-bumper standards. We're working with each of those organizations to include the research that we've done as components within those standards. Right now, each of these documents, the NFPA 1917 and the GVS 2015, do include references to the seat, cot, and equipment work. It's up to all of you to decide which ones you choose to adopt and how you tend to use these. But just in quick summary, we've already published, all of these in green are published, front, side, and rear impact pulses. That's what we use to run a sled based on our crash test work. We've published a standard for occupant seating and restraint, for the litter, and for equipment mounts. These are all published through the Society of Automotive Engineers. We have ongoing projects that look at the excursion of the occupant, or how far he or she moves on the seat. We also have ongoing projects with SAE for cabinet closure and retention, patient compartment, the structural integrity itself, and we're on the verge of having one for the interior surface treatment. So there's a lot going on. And the key with all of these, I mentioned it early, is that this has all been done collaboratively between industry and government. There's not going to be a federal regulation anytime soon that dictates you need to do these. These are opportunities. These are opportunities that every buyer and state can take advantage of. That is the result of collaborative work. I have one last slide with my name and contact information if you need it. I'm sure it's available through other forums. And now I'm going to turn the podium back to Dia, who will give us another section.
Jim made reference to the fact that there's not going to be a federal law that comes out that dictates what testing ambulance design should be subject to. But there will be 3 out of 5 states that will have to change their laws or their rules related to ambulance vehicle design. As most of you know, is the place where you get your license as an EMT or paramedic is also an office that sets educational standards and does EMS response data collection. But most importantly and pertinent to this conversation today is that most state EMS offices also regulate the design of ambulances and the minimum standards that must be in place in order for a vehicle to be used as an ambulance in your state. So it's a pretty awesome amount of heavy lifting, given the fact that by our count, as far as the state EMS offices counts are concerned, there are 14,500 local EMS agencies in the United States. And historically, the state's approaches to regulating ambulance vehicle design in large part was either to adopt the federal purchase specification and incorporate it by reference as a standard in their state laws or rules, or in policy, or there are some states that regulate design without using the KKK specs, and then we've got a couple others. We found when we asked the question in 2012 that there are only 6 states that do not regulate the design of ambulances. Only 6. I'll show you in a map in a second. There are 13 that do regulate the design, but without any dependency on the KKK specifications. One state at the time responded as being other, and that was, as usual, Colorado, in their typical delegation practices to the county or local levels. That count is now 2. We found another state that falls into the other category. And then 30 states with reliance on the KKK specification. And so the green states are those that have that dependency in law or rule on the current KKK specification. And this poses a very specific challenge that I want to cover for you in a second. The gray states are those 6 that do not regulate design at all. So you could theoretically go buy a 1955 Cadillac and have at it. And the peach-colored states are those that regulate the design, but they do so with something other than the KKK. So, you know, what does this have to do with all this discussion about design and testing? Well, the General Services Administration announced that they're going to retire the KKK specification on September 30th of 2015. This creates an immediate problem for those states that incorporate the KKK standard in their laws or rules, because the Standard State Administrative Procedure Act does not allow the incorporation by reference of a document that no longer exists. So 3 out of 5 chance you're from a state that's going to have to go in and change their rules. So what do they change it to? Now, the KKK traditionally would do change orders in between versions and then adopt whatever new testing standards, traditionally those of the Ambulance Manufacturers Division of the National Truck Equipment Association, when a new letter version, as you know, now the KKK alphanumeric ends in 1822D or 1822E. So they would eventually be incorporated. But other design standards that have been mentioned already may or may not incorporate some of these new SAE testing standards that Jim just described to you. And these are really significant, the fact that these tests are emerging. But again, coupled with that requirement to incorporate an existing document, the state's challenge is that changing rules is a lengthy and expensive process, occasionally politically hostile, and often a career-ending move for a state EMS director. I can say that with some breadth of experience. And also, the state cycles for rule promulgation vary pretty wildly, and I mean to say wildly, not widely. So this creates kind of a real dilemma. Looking down the calendar at September 2015, what will your state do? Do you know? Has this been discussed at your state EMS advisory council level? Has a decision already been made? What is the new standard going to be if you're in one of those states with reliance on the KKK? Well, theoretically, a state could get out of the business of regulating ambulance design altogether. There are some who take a pretty dim view of that, given the results that may be possible as a result. The state's option is also to incorporate any of these new standards by reference. But there's also then that question of, well, then what happens in between versions? So the state adopts, all the above, name the alphabet soup, NFPA, CAS, whatever others might emerge in the future, or for that matter, one or more Canadian standards or European standards for that matter. But what about in the interim? What happens as far as new SAE tests that come out that prove critical to improving safety? So, the state EMS, your state EMS office has a decision to make. They can either initiate the rulemaking independently and through executive branch options, but they have to file the rationale for that, the cost implications for that. This, depending on the gravity of the changes, may qualify for what's called emergency rulemaking, meaning it can get done with expeditious public comment periods and get put into place faster. And it almost always includes testimony either before or after the rule promulgation in front of a board, a commission, or worst case scenario, a legislative committee. Clearly, your state's driven first and foremost by the safety of the EMS crews and the patients that you serve, ultimately protecting the public, thinking back on those 2/3 of those killed in an ambulance-involved crash or outside of the vehicle. This is the rest of the public that needs to be protected, but also preserving system stability in the face of possibly what could be a more expensive ambulance, but also having a defensible basis for the rulemaking. Your state EMS director cannot get up and testify in favor of changing your ambulance design rules without understanding why and being able to defend that. And testify ultimately about the rationale, and ideally the scientific rationale behind those changes. But also there's a clear desire among the states to have a true minimum standard, especially for those organizations that straddle state lines. So we are working on model rules for ambulance vehicle design for states to consider adoption. Certainly there are a lot of moving parts related to this right now, and I just encourage you to figure out what's going on in your state, because the clock's ticking. September 30th, 2015, from a legislative or rule promulgation perspective, is right around the corner. Steve, you're up.
Thank you, Dia, and thanks for everyone for joining us here today. Again, my name's Steve Spada. I'm with the NTEA, and we're one of the partners in this research program with NIOSH. So that's kind of our role in this. And what I'm hoping to do here today is kind of take what Jim and Dia have provided and lay out a standards landscape for you to help navigate this change that's coming and help you to best prepare for it. Kind of first off, as Dia mentioned, we've got quite an alphabet soup of acronyms that are used in all of this, SAE being one of them. And I thought SAE might not be one of the well-known organizations in the EMS industry, so I thought it was important to touch on that organization a little bit to understand why they're involved. SAE, as Jim mentioned, it stands for the Society of Automotive Engineers. They've been around for over a century now, and that organization is integral to ground and air transportation in this country. And we had an opportunity a couple of years ago to approach SAE to take the research that we've been developing and have them help us refine it and take it to the next level, and if agreeable, to publish this work and have this reside in their standards home, and they've done that. And so now we have a permanent residence for this interrelated family of ambulance standards. And that's important because SAE standards are very much considered the gold standard in the automotive industry. So we were really glad that we could work with them and further the work through their standards process. So they took the work that we had crafted and put it through, yet again, their own standards development process. And their documents are widely used in regulatory fashion as well, both for the federal motor vehicle safety standards here in the U.S., Canadian motor vehicle safety standards, and abroad. A key point in this, though, is that these SAE documents are not regulations in and of themselves. As Jim and Dia both kind of touched on here, they're referenced from other documents, and that's important in understanding how these new test methods will be incorporated and ultimately end up as a requirement by any of the individual states. So depending on what controlling document, if it's one of the bumper-to-bumper standards that Jim mentioned, and I'll go through some of those in a moment, depending on which of these standards are being used by your individual state, and if those documents are incorporating these new SAE tests, that's what's going to determine when and how these new test procedures are going to evolve into an ambulance that you'd be purchasing in the future. So that's the mechanism for how these tests are ultimately going to become a state requirement. And just to go through some of these here, the controlling documents, these are in no particular order, but just starting with the triple K spec, I think most people are familiar with. That's our industry de facto standard. GSA has indicated that whether it's October 15th, October 30th, whatever the date may be, they will replace the K-spec with an industry consensus standard, and there's actually a public law that requires them to do so. Currently, the K-spec does not contain references to the three new SAE standards for litters, seating, and equipment mounting. But, and also GSA's indicated they're not planning to issue a revision G. So what that tells us is that GSA will continue using what they call change notice to bring about additions to the current revision of the K-spec. So that's how they'll continue to migrate changes with it. And the years in which they issue change notices, typically those go into effect on July 1st. I included some web links here for this and the other documents I'm going to cover, so if these slides are available afterwards, you have an ability to go and view these same documents I'm going to go through here. Another avenue for these SAE standards becoming a requirement of the state is through the NFPA 1917 document. That's now going through its second revision. The committee work on that is already completed. It should publish somewhere second, third quarter of next year, and it does contain the three SAE tests that Jim mentioned, and that would have an effective date of January 1st of 2016. Also, the CAS document, as Jim mentioned, that's a new standard that's being created by that organization. The draft of that document is also out. It's out for public comment now, and that does contain, again, these same three new SAE test methods. And that document's scheduled to publish somewhere the first part of next year, and then that would go into effect currently, as we understand it, in October of next year. And if three choices aren't enough, there's another possibility. There's the existing ASTM document that's been out there for a while, the F2020 document. There's not been an indication that ASTM's looking to incorporate these new SAE tests by reference, but it is certainly a possibility. So that document could conceivably, in its next revision, pull in these same requirements here. But just to give you a little bit of a visual to what's going on here and help get your arms around what all's in play, if we look at this from a probability standpoint, we've got 3 likely controlling documents that are going to be coming into effect and likely changing over the next year, year and a half. And any or all 3 of these documents in their published form can contain these new SAE tests by reference. So if we look at KKK, the next change notice that would come out would be number 7. So if GSA elects to put out a change notice 7 and incorporate these new SAE tests in them, most likely the effective date of that change notice would be July 1st of 2015. So the change notice itself might come out in the spring, but then have an effective date of July 1st. The CAS document, as I mentioned, that also has the 3 SAE tests in them currently. So if the final form of that document publishes with those intact, first part of next year, that would go into effect in October. Likewise, with the new 1917 document, that would, assuming that stays intact and keeps the SAE standards in there through its publication, that would publish somewhere second, third quarter, and then go into effect on January 1st of 2016. So KKK could actually be the early adopter of this. But hopefully this gives you an idea of what's coming in and when these different controlling documents would be available. So lots going on in ambulances. There's definitely a lot of activity in creating standards for them. So what does this mean? What do we know now? Well, we've got not just the rollout of these new SAE standards, but the controlling documents that would reference them are also in flux, and they're multiplying and becoming more stringent. And all of that tends to lead to not being able to do today or tomorrow what you're doing today. So variety for the type of equipment you're using is likely going to narrow, at least initially. And one of the big changes in particular is going to be in the attachment hardware for litters. The litter attachments are moving towards a new track-mounted system. It's going to limit the interchangeability of existing gurneys, and the antler system that we know today is going to phase out. Also, if you're a fan of Velcro, I regret to inform you that that's probably not going to make it as an equipment mount in light of these new documents here. And all of this change typically comes at a cost. That would sound like a bunch of bad news here, but there's plenty of good news in addition to having a safer ambulance. The manufacturers that have been involved in this research program have already been working towards achieving these new performance requirements with their existing products. So it's already being phased in. They've got product already coming to market that is going to meet these, these new levels of performance for seats, litters, and equipment. And that helps amortize the cost. So that process has already started of having the cost of this increase in performance amortized. So take full advantage of your time here at the expo. Talk to the seating manufacturers, talk to the litter manufacturers, the equipment manufacturers. Find out what they've got coming that they're developing and bringing online to meet these new requirements. Talk to the ambulance manufacturers. Use them as a resource to help keep a track of these new controlling documents and what's happening there, as well as the products that are coming online to meet these new SAE tests. And something, now for something not completely different, but still important to understand, is another facet of this research, Jim mentioned this a little bit, has been taken on by Department of Homeland Security And the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and not to throw more acronyms in here, but DHS and NIST, took on the task of examining what are the tasks that EMS workers need to do and how frequently do they do them. And they coupled that with some standardized human dimensions for ergonomics and reach and accessibility of equipment and things in proximity to the occupants in the patient compartment, and produced this new, it's a long title here, Ambulance Patient Compartment Human Factors Design Guidebook. So anyway, the guidebook is really going to be a tool for you as an end user, as well as the manufacturers, to help create a more ergonomic and safe layout of your patient compartment. So definitely use this tool. It's going to publish here, should be by the end of the year, so it should be out shortly. And it's actually already referenced in Change Notice 6 in KKK. So the last change notice already incorporates this document ahead of its publication. And that's all I have. Thank you, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jay.
To look back at everything that's been said, we talk about the totality of our systems, and I will tell you that it takes a village, not just manufacturers and not just regulators, not just system administrators, but even as an EMS system designer, we did our first procurement specifications for a community where we required light control systems be installed on ambulances, and there was, you know, some people saying, well, we don't want to do that. You know, that costs $5,000 per truck. And we said, but it's part of the culture of changing our approach to how we're going to keep our people safe and how we're going to keep our patients safe. I wish to thank our panelists today and Furno for sponsoring this session. And there will be Furno representatives in the room, and they'll be pleased to answer questions that you have about any specific equipment pieces as you depart. Thank you.